The brutal reality of the Mongol conquest. What no documentary shows you. The city gates are closed long before sunset. Merchants have abandoned the roads. Farmers who normally return at dusk have not been seen for days. Along the walls, guards stare into the endless darkness beyond the horizon, searching for something they cannot yet see but already fear. Then the refugees arrive. Their horses are exhausted. Their clothes are stained with dust and dried blood. Some refuse to speak. Others can speak of nothing else. They tell stories that seem impossible. Entire armies erased. Fortified cities reduced to silence. Kingdoms that believed themselves untouchable suddenly disappearing from the map. The rulers inside the city dismiss the reports. How could a distant people from the windswept grasslands threaten civilizations that possess wealth? Stone fortifications, libraries, cathedrals, palaces, and armies numbering in the tens of thousands. How could horsemen from the edge of the known world challenge societies that have flourished for centuries? The answer is already moving toward them. Far beyond the city walls, thousands of riders cross rivers, mountains, deserts, and open plains with terrifying speed. They carry no banners announcing their arrival. They do not seek recognition from kings. They do not care about ancient traditions or inherited prestige. They bring something far more dangerous, a completely different understanding of war. For generations, the great civilizations of Eurasia measured power through territory, wealth, monuments, and population. The Mongols measured power differently. They measured it through mobility, discipline, endurance, intelligence, and absolute adaptability. While kingdoms invested decades constructing walls, the Mongols perfected the ability to make walls irrelevant. That difference would change the course of history. As night deepens, the city settles into uneasy silence. Families gather inside their homes. Soldiers sharpen weapons they may soon need. Priests offer prayers. Leaders debate reports arriving from distant frontiers. No one knows that they are standing at the edge of a new era. Within a few generations, the largest contiguous empire in human history will stretch across continents. Ancient powers will collapse. Trade routes will be transformed. Entire populations will be uprooted. Millions of lives will be changed forever. Yet this story is not simply about conquest. It is not merely the story of Genghis Khan, legendary battles, or expanding borders. It is the story of ordinary people who watched history arrive on horseback. It is the story of merchants who saw familiar roads become dangerous frontiers, of rulers forced to make impossible choices, of soldiers facing an enemy unlike any they had imagined, of families caught between resistance and survival. Most importantly, it is the story of what happened when the world's most confident civilizations encountered a force they neither understood nor respected until it was too late. Because the true reality of the Mongol conquest is not found only in maps showing territorial expansion. It is found in the fear that spread before the armies arrived. It is found in the decisions made during moments of uncertainty. And it is found in the countless lives forever altered by the sound of distant hooves, growing louder in the darkness. The question is not how the Mongols conquered so much of the world. The question is why so much of the world never saw them coming. The civilization gap that should have protected the world. At the beginning of the 13th century, the balance of power across Eurasia appeared settled. Great empires dominated the landscape. Massive cities controlled trade routes stretching thousands of miles. Wealth flowed through marketplaces crowded with merchants from distant lands. Kings ruled from fortified capitals protected by thick walls and professional armies. To the people living within these civilizations, history seemed to follow a predictable pattern. Powerful states competed against other powerful states. Threats emerged from neighboring kingdoms, rival dynasties, or ambitious generals. Few imagined that the greatest challenge to their world would come from beyond the edge of what they considered civilization itself. Far to the east, Beyond the mountains, deserts, and established centers of power stretched the immense grasslands of the Mongolian steppe. To outsiders, it looked like an empty world. There were no monumental cities rising from the horizon, no famous universities attracting scholars, no grand palaces displaying wealth and prestige. The nomadic tribes who lived there appeared primitive when compared to the sophisticated societies of China, Persia, or the Islamic world. Most rulers viewed the steppe as a source of occasional raids, not as the birthplace of a force capable of reshaping continents. That assumption contained a fatal flaw. The great civilizations judged the Mongols according to their own standards. They believed strength came from population size, economic power, engineering achievements, and territorial control. They assumed that people who lacked these advantages could never compete with those who possessed them. Yet while wealthy kingdoms invested resources into maintaining complex bureaucracies and defending fixed borders, the people of the steppe were developing a completely different set of strengths. Their world demanded mobility instead of permanence, adaptability instead of stability, endurance instead of comfort. What appeared to be weakness from afar was quietly becoming a competitive advantage, unlike anything Eurasia had seen before. The contrast became even more dangerous because it encouraged overconfidence. Powerful rulers looked at maps and saw distance protecting them. They looked at their armies and saw superiority. They looked at their walls and saw security. Every visible measure of power reinforced the belief that their position was unshakable. Even when reports began arriving about the growing influence of a new leader among the Mongol tribes, many dismissed the news as another temporary shift in steppe politics. Similar stories had emerged before. None had changed the world. Why would this one be any different? What these rulers failed to recognize was that the steppe itself was creating something unprecedented. Every hardship endured by its people became a lesson in survival. Every conflict between tribes became training for larger wars. Every journey across vast distances taught skills that settled societies rarely needed to master. While kingdoms grew comfortable inside established systems, the Mongols were becoming experts at operating beyond them. They were learning how to move faster, adapt faster, and respond faster than any opponent they would eventually face. By the time neighboring states began to understand that something extraordinary was happening, the transformation was already well underway. The old assumptions that had governed international power for centuries were about to be tested. The world believed civilization itself provided protection. The Mongols were preparing to prove that discipline, mobility, and relentless adaptation could overcome advantages that had once seemed impossible to challenge. Yet an even bigger question remains unanswered. How did a people living in one of the harshest environments on Earth develop the mindset, resilience, and culture that made such a transformation possible? To understand that, we must leave the cities behind and enter the unforgiving world that shaped the Mongols long before they began conquering it. The culture of hardship that forged an empire. Long before the Mongols conquered kingdoms, they first conquered the challenges of survival. Their homeland was not a place that rewarded weakness. The Mongolian steppe stretched endlessly across the horizon, a vast and unforgiving landscape where bitter winters could freeze entire herds and scorching summers could turn grasslands into dry seas of dust. There were no protective city walls, no reliable harvests, no rivers capable of sustaining large populations. Every season brought uncertainty. Every year became a test of endurance. In this world, survival was never guaranteed. It had to be earned again and again. From childhood, Mongol boys and girls were introduced to realities that would have overwhelmed many people living in settled civilizations. Children learned to ride horses almost as soon as they could walk. They spent countless hours exposed to harsh weather, traveling across open terrain where danger could emerge without warning. Hunting was not a sport, but a necessity. Tracking animals required patience, observation, and precision. Missing a target could mean losing valuable food. Over time, these skills became second nature. What outsiders viewed as a difficult life was quietly producing generations of remarkably capable people. The horse stood at the center of this existence. For most civilizations, transportation depended on roads, carts, or ships. For the Mongols, the horse was freedom, survival, and power combined into one. Riders could cover astonishing distances in a matter of days. Messages traveled quickly across territories that would have taken others weeks to cross. Entire communities could relocate when conditions changed. This mobility created a society that viewed movement not as a challenge, but as an advantage. While settled kingdoms became attached to specific locations, the Mongols learned to think in terms of possibilities rather than boundaries. Yet hardship alone does not create an empire. Many societies have faced difficult environments without changing the course of history. What made the Mongols different was the way their culture transformed necessity into strength. Cooperation became essential because isolated families rarely survived for long. Loyalty carried enormous value because betrayal could have deadly consequences. Leadership was respected when it produced results. Not because of ancient titles or inherited prestige, the realities of life on the steppe rewarded competence above all else. Over time, these values shaped a society that could adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. This culture also fostered a unique relationship with warfare. Conflict between tribes was common, forcing leaders to constantly evaluate threats, opportunities, and alliances. Battles were often decided by mobility, deception, and timing rather than overwhelming numbers. Young warriors gained experience early. They learned to endure long campaigns, survive with limited resources, and operate effectively across vast distances. What many outsiders dismissed as tribal warfare was actually creating generations of highly skilled fighters accustomed to uncertainty and constant competition. Perhaps most importantly, life on the steppe taught a lesson that many wealthy civilizations had forgotten. Nothing was permanent. Herds could disappear. Alliances could collapse. Weather could change without warning. Survival belonged to those who adapted faster than everyone else. This mindset became one of the greatest advantages the Mongols would carry into their future conquests. While their enemies often relied on traditions, assumptions, and established systems, the Mongols developed a culture that expected change and embraced it. The great cities of Eurasia saw power in stone walls, gold reserves, and ancient institutions. The Mongols found power in resilience, discipline, and adaptability. Those qualities were being forged long before a single empire existed, and soon, one man would emerge who understood how to unite these strengths into something the world had never witnessed before. His rise would transform a collection of rival tribes into a force capable of shaking every civilization from China to Europe. Why the Mongols seemed to appear out of nowhere. When people look back at the Mongol conquests, it often feels as if they emerged from the horizon without warning, sweeping across continents with impossible speed. One moment, the great powers of Eurasia were focused on their familiar rivals. The next, entire kingdoms were collapsing before an enemy many had barely considered. To those living through the events, it seemed as though the Mongols had suddenly appeared from nowhere. In reality, the signs had been there all along. The problem was that almost nobody knew how to interpret them. For centuries, the Mongolian steppe had been divided among competing tribes and rival leaders. Alliances formed and dissolved with remarkable speed. Conflicts erupted constantly. To neighboring civilizations, these struggles appeared insignificant. They were viewed as local disputes occurring far from the centers of power that truly mattered. Chinese officials monitored the frontier. Merchants crossed portions of the steppe. Diplomats gathered fragments of information. Yet few believed that anything emerging from this fragmented world could become a threat on a continental scale. Everything began to change when one leader accomplished what many thought impossible. Temujin, the man who would later become known as Genghis Khan, did not simply defeat rival tribes. He transformed the political structure of the steppe itself. For generations, loyalty had been tied to family connections, tribal identity, and inherited status. Temujin systematically challenged these traditions. He promoted capable individuals regardless of their birth. He rewarded effectiveness. He demanded loyalty to a larger vision. In doing so, he created something far more dangerous than another tribal coalition. He created unity where division had always existed. Even then, the magnitude of this transformation remained largely invisible to the outside world. Settled civilizations often underestimated developments occurring beyond their borders because they measured power through familiar institutions. They looked for expanding cities, growing bureaucracies, and visible signs of state formation. The Mongols built strength differently. Their empire was forming through relationships, discipline, organization, and military restructuring. The foundations of future conquest were being laid. But they did not resemble the foundations of traditional empires. As a result, many observers failed to appreciate what was happening. The first major warnings arrived through military encounters. Armies sent against the Mongols expected victories and instead suffered shocking defeats. Commanders discovered opponents capable of moving faster than anticipated, adapting to changing conditions, and coordinating operations across enormous distances. Reports describing these encounters spread through courts and capitals, yet disbelief often diluted the message. Powerful states had spent centuries viewing nomadic peoples as secondary threats. Accepting that the balance of power was changing required abandoning assumptions that had existed for generations. This blindness became even more dangerous as Mongol successes accumulated. Victories that should have triggered alarm were often explained away as isolated incidents. Leaders convinced themselves that neighboring kingdoms had failed because of poor decisions, weak generals, or unique circumstances. They rarely considered the possibility that a fundamentally new military force was emerging. By the time that realization began to spread, the Mongols were no longer a regional power. They were becoming an international phenomenon capable of projecting strength across thousands of miles. The most remarkable aspect of their rise was not merely how quickly it happened, but how completely it caught established civilizations off guard. The world had become accustomed to predictable patterns of competition. The Mongols shattered those expectations. They expanded faster than information could travel. They adapted faster than their enemies could react. They challenged assumptions that many leaders did not even realize they were making. What seemed like a sudden appearance was actually the result of years of transformation hidden behind the horizon of conventional thinking. Soon, however, surprise would evolve into something far more powerful. As stories of Mongol victories spread from one region to another, fear itself would begin to reshape the decisions of kings, generals, merchants, and ordinary people. Entire societies would start reacting not only to what the Mongols had done, but to what they might do next, and that fear would become one of the most effective weapons in the Mongol arsenal. The psychology of collapse. The first victims of the Mongol conquest were not cities, they were assumptions. Long before Mongol horsemen appeared outside distant walls, something else arrived first. Stories. Traders carried them across caravan routes, refugees spread them from village to village. Diplomats reported them to royal courts. Each account seemed more unbelievable than the last. Entire armies disappearing, fortresses falling in days, commanders fleeing battlefields they had expected to dominate. To many listeners, these reports sounded exaggerated. History had always produced rumors during times of war. Surely this was no different. But the stories did not stop. Weeks later, new reports arrived. Then more. The names changed, but the pattern remained the same. Another city had fallen. Another ruler had been defeated. Another region had vanished from the political map. What made these reports so unsettling was not merely the scale of the destruction. It was the consistency. Again and again, societies that should have been able to resist were collapsing with alarming speed. Gradually, disbelief gave way to uncertainty. Uncertainty gave way to anxiety. Anxiety began to spread faster than the Mongols themselves. In royal palaces and military headquarters, leaders faced a dangerous dilemma. Every decision became clouded by incomplete information. Some argued that the threat was exaggerated. Others insisted that extraordinary measures were necessary. Valuable time disappeared in debate. Resources were allocated inefficiently. Rival factions blamed one another. The more uncertainty grew, the harder it became to form coherent strategies. The Mongols benefited from something every commander dreams of achieving: enemies who began defeating themselves before the battle even started. The psychological effect extended far beyond rulers and generals. Merchants altered trade routes to avoid rumored danger zones. Families abandoned homes based on second-hand accounts. Soldiers entered campaigns already convinced they faced an unstoppable enemy. Fear transformed isolated military defeats into regional crises. A single Mongol victory could trigger panic hundreds of miles away among people who had never even seen a Mongol warrior. In many cases, perception became more influential than reality. The Mongols understood this phenomenon better than most of their opponents. They recognized that fear multiplied power. A defeated army could be replaced. A damaged fortress could be rebuilt. But confidence, once shattered, was far more difficult to restore. Every victory became part of a larger psychological campaign. Every rumor strengthened their reputation. Every story increased uncertainty among future enemies. The Mongols were not simply conquering territory. They were conquering expectations. As confidence eroded, mistakes became inevitable. Some rulers delayed preparations because they hoped the danger would pass elsewhere. Others overreacted, exhausting resources before the Mongols even arrived. Alliances weakened under pressure. Strategic planning became reactive instead of proactive. The psychological landscape of Eurasia began changing before many battlefields ever did. Entire regions entered a state of collective tension, unsure whether they would be next. This growing atmosphere of fear created a haunting question in the minds of countless people. What would happen when the stories stopped being stories? What would happen when the distant reports became visible on the horizon? Soon, merchants, soldiers, rulers, and ordinary families would no longer rely on rumors to understand the Mongols. They would witness their arrival firsthand, and the reality waiting beyond the city walls would prove even more terrifying than the legends. What it felt like when the Mongols arrived. For years, people had heard the stories. They heard them in crowded marketplaces, along trade routes, inside royal courts, and around campfires. Tales of cities that vanished. Tales of armies that never returned. Tales so terrifying that many dismissed them as exaggerations. Human beings have always struggled to believe disasters until they stand directly before them. Then one day, for countless communities across Eurasia, the stories became reality. The first sign was often not the army itself. It was the silence. Caravans failed to arrive. Travelers disappeared. Messages stopped coming. Roads that had once connected distant regions suddenly felt abandoned. Local leaders sensed that something was wrong, but information traveled slowly. Rumors filled the gaps. Every day without news created new fears. Then scouts began reporting movement in the distance. Dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Refugees arrived with desperate warnings. The uncertainty that had haunted entire regions suddenly transformed into certainty. Inside threatened cities, daily life began to change. Markets became quieter. Families stored food. Religious leaders gathered larger crowds. Soldiers reinforced gates and repaired defensive positions. Conversations became dominated by a single question: would the city survive? Some believed their walls would protect them. Others were less certain. Everyone understood that something enormous was approaching, even if they could not yet comprehend its full scale. Then came the moment many survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. The appearance of the Mongol army, not as scattered raiders, not as a temporary threat, but as an organized force stretching across the landscape with a discipline that few enemies expected. Riders moved with remarkable coordination. Reconnaissance units operated far ahead of the main force. Signals traveled quickly through the ranks. There was an unsettling efficiency to everything they did. For defenders watching from the walls, the realization was immediate. This enemy was unlike any they had faced before. Fear affected people differently. Some prepared for resistance. Others searched for ways to flee. Families debated impossible choices. Should they remain inside the city and trust its defenses? Should they abandon homes, businesses, and possessions in hopes of escaping? Every option carried risk. Every decision could determine survival. In those moments, history stopped feeling distant and abstract. It became personal. The fate of empires suddenly depended on individual choices made under extraordinary pressure. For soldiers, the psychological burden was immense. Many had already heard stories of previous battles. They knew the reputation of the force standing before them. Some fought with determination. Others struggled against the growing belief that defeat was inevitable. The Mongols understood this dynamic well. They recognized that fear weakened resistance long before combat began. Every hour spent outside the walls increased tension inside them. Every demonstration of discipline and confidence intensified uncertainty among defenders. What makes these moments so powerful is that they were experienced not by famous rulers or legendary generals, but by ordinary people. Merchants wondering if they would ever reopen their shops. Parents trying to calm frightened children. Young soldiers standing guard through sleepless nights. Elders watching familiar streets transform into places of anxiety and anticipation. The Mongol conquest was not only a military event, it was a human event, lived one fearful day at a time by millions of individuals whose names history would never record. Yet as terrifying as the arrival of the Mongols was, an even greater mystery remained. How could an army operate across such vast distances with such consistency, speed, and coordination? How could forces separated by hundreds of miles move as if they shared a single mind? Behind every conquest stood an invisible system that most enemies never fully understood, and that hidden machinery would become one of the greatest sources of Mongol power. The hidden machinery behind the conquests. To those watching from city walls, the Mongols often appeared unstoppable. They seemed capable of emerging anywhere, crossing impossible distances, and winning battles against enemies who possessed greater numbers and greater resources. Many assumed their success came solely from fearless warriors or brilliant battlefield tactics. But behind every victory stood something far less visible and far more important, a system of organization so effective that most of their enemies never fully understood it until it was too late. The Mongol Empire was built upon movement. While many armies of the era struggled with supply lines, slow communication, and cumbersome logistics, the Mongols developed a way of operating that transformed distance from an obstacle into an advantage. Their warriors traveled with multiple horses, allowing them to maintain extraordinary speed over long periods. Fresh mounts meant that entire units could move farther and faster than opponents believed possible. This mobility created constant uncertainty. Enemies rarely knew where the next attack would come from because the Mongols could appear in places that conventional armies could not reach quickly. Communication formed another pillar of their success. Across the expanding empire, a sophisticated relay network allowed messages to travel at remarkable speeds. Couriers moved from station to station, carrying information across vast territories. Orders, Intelligence reports and strategic updates flowed through this system far faster than most rival states could manage. In an age when information often traveled no faster than a horse could ride, the Mongols created a communication structure that gave leaders a level of awareness rarely seen in medieval warfare. Discipline was equally critical. Many armies depended heavily on the personal initiative of individual commanders. The Mongols emphasized coordination. Units operated according to clearly understood responsibilities. Warriors trained to function as part of a larger system rather than as isolated fighters seeking personal glory. This allowed Mongol forces to execute complex maneuvers under difficult conditions. Retreats could become traps. Diversions could conceal larger operations. Separate forces could coordinate attacks across enormous distances. What looked chaotic to observers was often carefully planned. Intelligence gathering played a role that cannot be overstated. Before major campaigns, the Mongols sought information relentlessly. Scouts explored terrain. Merchants provided insights about trade routes and regional conditions. Diplomats collected valuable knowledge during negotiations. Every detail mattered. Rivers, roads, political rivalries, food supplies, defensive weaknesses, and local leadership structures were studied whenever possible. By the time Mongol armies arrived, they often knew far more about their targets than those targets knew about them. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this system was its flexibility. Many powerful empires became trapped by their own institutions. Large bureaucracies often struggled to adapt quickly. Traditional military structures could be rigid and predictable. The Mongols operated differently. They adjusted strategies based on circumstances. They learned from victories and failures alike. They incorporated useful technologies, expertise, and specialists from conquered territories. Their empire functioned less like a static structure and more like a living organism constantly adapting to new challenges. This hidden machinery explains why so many opponents misjudged them. Enemies saw horsemen and assumed they understood the threat. They focused on the visible warriors while overlooking the organizational foundation supporting them. Yet it was this foundation that allowed the Mongols to project power across continents. Behind every charge, every siege, and every victory stood an extraordinary system built upon speed, communication, intelligence, discipline, and adaptation. But conquest creates new problems. Winning battles is one challenge. Living under the rule of the victors is another. As Mongol dominance expanded across Eurasia, millions of people faced a difficult reality. Resistance could be dangerous. Cooperation could be dangerous as well. Entire societies now had to learn a new set of rules for survival in a world transformed by Mongol power. The new rules of survival. For those who lived under the shadow of Mongol rule, the conquest did not end when the fighting stopped. In many ways, the most difficult chapter began afterward. The smoke cleared, the armies moved on. The banners of former rulers disappeared from government buildings and city gates, yet the people remained. Merchants still needed to trade, farmers still needed to harvest crops, families still needed to find food, shelter, and security. The world they had known was gone, but life itself continued. The challenge now was learning how to survive inside a reality that had been fundamentally transformed. Many communities quickly discovered that old assumptions no longer applied. Political loyalties that had once guaranteed protection could become liabilities overnight. Powerful families found their influence diminished. Former officials struggled to navigate unfamiliar systems of authority. Entire populations were forced to reassess whom they could trust and what future they could realistically expect. The conquest had changed more than governments. It had changed the rules by which society operated. For rulers and local elites, the choices were often agonizing. Some attempted to resist even after major defeats, hoping to reclaim lost independence. Others concluded that cooperation offered the best chance of preserving their people and institutions. Neither path guaranteed success. Resistance risked provoking further military action. Cooperation carried the danger of being viewed as betrayal by one's own population. Across Eurasia, leaders faced decisions that would shape the lives of thousands, sometimes millions of people. Ordinary citizens confronted their own dilemmas. A merchant who once traded freely across regional borders now had to understand the priorities of new authorities. Religious communities sought ways to preserve their traditions while adapting to changing political realities. Artisans, scholars, and administrators discovered that skills valued by one regime could also be valued by another. Survival increasingly depended on flexibility. Those capable of adapting often found opportunities within the new order. Those unable or unwilling to change faced a much harsher future. What makes this period so remarkable is that the Mongol Empire was not interested in ruling every community in exactly the same way. Across their vast territories, Mongol leaders frequently adjusted policies to local circumstances. Some regions received significant autonomy. Others experienced tighter oversight. In many cases, practical considerations mattered more than ideology. Stability, productivity, and loyalty were often valued above cultural uniformity. This approach created a complex and sometimes unpredictable environment where local conditions could differ dramatically from one region to another. The result was a world filled with uncertainty, but also possibility. While some people experienced loss and hardship, others found new avenues for advancement. Trade networks reopened under new protections. Certain professions became increasingly valuable. Travel that had once been dangerous in fragmented regions became more secure across large stretches of territory. The same empire that had arrived through conquest was now creating opportunities that few would have imagined during the years of war. Yet these changes were only the beginning. As Mongol rule expanded and stabilized, something unexpected started to happen. Roads, once divided by hostile borders, became connected. Goods traveled farther than before. Ideas crossed continents. Technologies, religions, and knowledge moved between civilizations that had rarely interacted directly. The empire that many feared as a force of destruction was about to become one of history's most powerful engines of connection, reshaping Eurasia in ways that would outlast the conquests themselves. The empire that rewired Eurasia. For centuries, Eurasia had been a world of barriers. Mountains separated civilizations, deserts isolated kingdoms. Political rivalries disrupted trade. Countless borders divided peoples who rarely interacted directly. A merchant traveling from East Asia toward the Mediterranean would pass through a maze of competing states, shifting alliances, local conflicts, and unpredictable dangers. Distance was not measured only in miles, it was measured in uncertainty. Then, in one of history's greatest ironies, the same force that had shattered so many societies began connecting them. As the Mongol Empire expanded across an immense portion of Eurasia, vast regions that had once been fragmented fell under a single political framework. For the first time in generations, merchants could travel across enormous distances under a relatively stable system of authority. Caravan routes that linked distant worlds became more active than ever before. What had once been a collection of disconnected regions slowly transformed into a network of interconnected pathways stretching across continents. The effects were extraordinary. Goods moved farther and faster than many people thought possible. Silk, spices, precious metals, textiles, and luxury products crossed thousands of miles. Markets gained access to items that had previously been rare or completely unknown. Wealth flowed through trade corridors connecting east and west. Entire cities grew because they occupied strategic positions within these expanding commercial networks. Economic activity flourished on a scale that few contemporaries could fully comprehend. But products were only part of the story. Ideas traveled alongside them. Scholars encountered knowledge developed in distant civilizations. Scientific observations crossed cultural boundaries. Engineering techniques, medical practices, and artistic influences moved from one region to another. Innovations that might once have remained isolated within a single society suddenly had opportunities to spread across vast territories. The Mongol world became a corridor through which information flowed with unprecedented intensity. Travelers also played an important role in this transformation. Diplomats, merchants, missionaries, explorers, and adventurers journeyed across lands that previous generations would have considered inaccessible. They returned with descriptions of unfamiliar cultures, technologies, and political systems. Their accounts expanded horizons and challenged assumptions. For many people, the world became larger and more interconnected than it had ever seemed before. Yet this growing connectivity carried consequences that extended beyond commerce and knowledge. Increased movement linked societies in ways they had never experienced. Opportunities expanded, but so did vulnerabilities. Events occurring in one region could now influence distant populations with surprising speed. The interconnected world emerging under Mongol rule created benefits, risks, and historical consequences that would echo far beyond the empire itself. This is what makes the Mongol legacy so difficult to define. The same conquests that produced immense suffering also accelerated exchanges that transformed civilizations. Destruction and connection became intertwined. The empire rewired Eurasia not through a single achievement but through a vast web of interactions that reshaped how people, goods, and ideas moved across the world. Yet while trade routes flourished and cultures interacted in new ways, another reality remained hidden beneath the surface. Maps showing expanding territory and thriving connections rarely revealed the full human cost of these transformations. Behind every line drawn across an empire stood communities forever altered by war, displacement, loss, and memory. To understand the true legacy of the Mongol conquest, we must look beyond the maps and confront the lives that paid the price. The human cost hidden behind the maps. History often tells the story of empires through maps. A colored line expands across a continent. Borders shift. Territories merge. Vast regions fall under a new authority. Looking at these maps centuries later, it is easy to focus on scale, strategy, and political transformation. But maps have a limitation. They show where an empire grew. They rarely show what people lost. Behind every Mongol advance stood countless individual lives interrupted by forces beyond their control. Entire communities were forced to abandon homes that had belonged to their families for generations. Farmers left fields they would never cultivate again. Merchants watched trade networks collapse before new ones emerged. Local leaders saw institutions disappear almost overnight. For many people, the conquest was not experienced as a historical event. It was experienced as the sudden destruction of everything familiar. The demographic consequences were enormous. Some regions suffered catastrophic population losses through warfare, famine, displacement, and the cascading effects of instability. Cities that had once been centers of culture and commerce struggled to recover. Certain communities vanished from historical records entirely. In some places, generations grew up surrounded by reminders of a world that no longer existed. The scars left by conquest often lasted far longer than the campaigns themselves. Yet physical destruction tells only part of the story. Psychological wounds can survive long after buildings are rebuilt. Imagine living in a society where stories of invasion are passed from parents to children and from children to grandchildren. Imagine growing up hearing how entire regions were transformed within a single lifetime. Across Eurasia, memories of the Mongol conquests became embedded in collective identity. Some remembered terror. Others remembered resilience. Many remembered both. These experiences shaped how communities understood power, security, and survival for centuries afterward. Cultural consequences emerged as well. Languages mixed, traditions evolved. New influences entered regions through migration, trade, and political change. Some customs disappeared, others adapted. Conquest did not simply redraw political boundaries. It altered the social fabric of entire populations. The effects could be seen in art, literature, religious practice, and local traditions long after the empire itself began to fragment. What makes the Mongol conquest particularly complex is that its consequences were rarely uniform. One community might remember devastation, another might remember opportunity. One generation might focus on loss, the next might focus on adaptation. The legacy of the empire differed depending on where people lived and how they experienced its arrival. This complexity explains why historians continue debating the Mongols centuries later. Their story resists simple conclusions. When we step back and look beyond the victories, the battles, and the expanding borders, a different picture emerges. We see millions of people navigating uncertainty. We see families rebuilding after upheaval. We see societies transformed in ways that cannot be measured solely through territory or military success. The true scale of the Mongol conquest is found not only in how much land changed hands, but in how many lives changed forever. And yet, after all the destruction, all the transformation, all the fear and adaptation, one final question remains. What was the lasting echo of the Mongol conquest? When the armies were gone, when the empire fractured, and when centuries began to pass, what remained behind? The answer lies in the silence that followed the thunder of hooves across Eurasia. The silence left by the hooves. The thunder eventually stopped. For generations, the sound of Mongol horses had echoed across deserts, grasslands, mountains, and fertile valleys. Entire civilizations learned to fear the arrival of riders appearing on distant horizons. Kingdoms rose and fell in response to their campaigns. Trade routes shifted. Alliances changed. The political map of Eurasia was transformed forever. Then, slowly, the momentum that had once seemed unstoppable began to fade. The empire did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. There was no final battle that marked the end of Mongol power. No decisive event that suddenly erased their influence. Instead, the vast empire gradually fragmented into separate realms, each pursuing its own interests. Distance, succession disputes, regional ambitions, and the sheer challenge of governing enormous territories weakened the unity that had fueled earlier expansion. The force that had connected so much of the world could not permanently hold together a domain of such immense scale. Yet the disappearance of political unity did not erase the changes the Mongols had set in motion. The roads remained, the connections remained, the memories remained. Merchants continued using routes that had flourished under Mongol protection. Travelers moved between regions that had once seemed impossibly distant. Knowledge exchanged during the era of conquest continued circulating across continents. Technologies, ideas, and cultural influences kept flowing through pathways the empire had helped establish. Even as Mongol political authority diminished, the world they had helped create continued evolving. For many communities, however, memory carried a different legacy. Stories survived long after armies vanished. In some regions, people remembered destruction and loss. They remembered cities that never fully recovered and generations shaped by fear. In others, the Mongols became symbols of strength, military brilliance, and extraordinary leadership. The same empire could be remembered as both a catastrophe and an achievement depending on whose story was being told. That tension remains one of the defining features of their historical legacy. This is why the Mongol conquest continues to fascinate historians centuries later. It defies simple judgment. The empire unleashed devastating violence across vast regions. At the same time, it accelerated exchanges that connected civilizations in unprecedented ways. It brought suffering to millions while also creating conditions that reshaped trade, communication, and cultural interaction. Few historical forces have produced consequences so destructive and transformative at the same time, and perhaps that is the reality most documentaries struggle to capture. The Mongol conquest was not merely a tale of brilliant generals, unstoppable cavalry, and expanding borders. Nor was it simply a story of destruction. It was a human story lived by rulers, merchants, soldiers, mothers, children, refugees, scholars, and survivors. It unfolded in crowded cities, isolated villages, royal palaces, and windswept battlefields. It changed the course of history because it changed the course of millions of individual lives. If we return to the city from the beginning of our story, we can imagine the watchman once more standing atop the walls. He hears the distant thunder of hooves. He does not know that he is witnessing the arrival of a force that will transform continents. He cannot see the trade routes that will emerge, the empires that will fall, or the generations that will inherit the consequences of this moment. He knows only that something is coming. Centuries later, we know what followed. We know the victories, the tragedies, the innovations, and the scars. We know that the Mongols changed the world in ways few other empires ever have. Yet perhaps the most important lesson is this: history is rarely defined by those who believe they are secure. Again and again, it is reshaped by forces that emerge where no one is looking, challenge assumptions everyone accepts, and leave behind a legacy far more complicated than victory or defeat. The hooves fell silent long ago. Their echoes never did.